Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. Shannon Smith with Key Title. I have Caleb Varnell with Varnell Law here today to talk to us about a couple different things, but one of the things that I'm really looking forward to talking about is the enhanced homeowners policy, because we've had a lot of people ask about that lately. But before I do that, I just wanted to give Caleb a chance to talk a little bit about himself and where his practice is so that we can help encourage people to consider working with Caleb.
Shannon, thanks for having me. I am Caleb Varnell, Varnell Law, or the law office of S. Caleb Varnell if you're looking for me. The S is for Stephen. So I grew up in Wilson, North Carolina, just down the road from where we're sitting here in Midtown Raleigh. I do have an office in Wilson. I also have an office here in North Hills. I lived in Raleigh for about 10 years after school and was practicing in Raleigh. And then life took me and my wife back to the western edge of Wilson County, a little community called Rock Ridge. And so I had already started my office in Wilson, or in Raleigh, I should say. And then I kept running into people and they would ask me, hey, can you help me with this? And I'd say, well, sure, but my office is in Raleigh. And if you don't know people from Wilson, they do not come to Raleigh for anything but a heart doctor. So that's when I opened that office in Wilson. It's been really good as Raleigh grows. Wilson's going to become a suburb of Raleigh. So that's me. That's where I'm at, Wilson and Raleigh, and happy to be here today.
Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, we were talking before the podcast, and Caleb has a background in education, and we were talking about, if you were a teacher and you can command a room with a bunch of children in it, you could probably conduct a closing really well.
Yeah.
With all the emotion and all the different things going on, and I'm sure a lot of people like coming to you for that reason. You keep everybody just at a calm, even keel.
That's
right?
the goal. I tell most people, most attorneys, the people that they're sitting across from are having a bad day. Real estate attorneys, more often than not, people are having one of the best days of their life. So that makes the job really easy. Every once in a while, you get people who are in transition that are having a tough time. But being able to keep control of the room does help.
And I'm sure by the time they get to your closing table, they're calm because everything's been handled.
Yes, 99% of the time we're having smooth closings, and then the ones with the hiccups, you just look like a hero when you get them to the closing table.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, and a strong agent that's worked with multiple attorneys, they know the difference. So
yes, they know. They can tell.
Hopefully they'll give you a shot. I also wanted to talk about the other areas of law that you practice. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the other areas too, just in case, because we were talking about how oftentimes when you're in a real estate transaction, it translates over into some of these other areas that you work in. So maybe you could talk briefly about that too.
Yeah, so I'm 75 to 80% real estate. That's really what I enjoy doing the most. Residential closing, some commercial, but I also do some estate planning. I find that real property law and estate planning law really go hand in hand because most people, the biggest asset that they have is their real property. And you would be surprised how many people I sit across the table from who are buying their first house or their 10th house and have no plan for if something were to happen to them. And I tell people all the time, it's hard to think about while you're still here, but you don't want to leave a mess for the people that you leave behind. So I encourage everybody who sits across the table from me at a closing, let's get that will or maybe even that trust done. Let's make sure we've got a good plan in place, durable power of attorney, healthcare directive, or what some people call a living will. So we do a lot of that. I do very little criminal work, just speeding tickets for friends. So I'll help you out, Shannon, if you ever get a speeding ticket in Wake County. I did one divorce. I don't like doing family law, but that one was an interesting case that I got to be a part of. So, but yeah, mostly real estate and then that estate planning, wills and trusts.
I did notice too that you did do some 1031 exchange work too.
And
maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I actually have a 1031 going on right now. And investors who underwrite for Key, they have, in my opinion, the best 1031 intermediary company in the state.
Hands down.
I send everybody to them. And right now, the one that I have going on, they're selling a property in the mountains, and they're going to be buying a farm in Granville County. And pretty much 1031s, people are a little bit scared of them because that 1031 comes from the IRS code 1031 and they don't know what to think about them, but they're pretty straightforward, especially if you use a good exchange company like Investors Title Exchange. The rules really are just make sure that it's an investment property going to an investment property. They call it a like kind exchange, but the properties don't have to be exactly the same. You can sell a improved real property in one part of the state and buy an unimproved piece of property in another part of the state. That's still a like kind exchange.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I didn't know that part. I knew about like kind. And so in my mind, I thought if it's a condo over here, you need to exchange it for a condo over here. But that's not necessarily the
No,
case.
not necessarily. The most important thing is, are you going commercial to commercial or residential to residential or something that could be considered residential? Farmland isn't necessarily residential, but it could be.
That's why they need to come to you so they can figure out if
That's
it
right.
qualifies.
That's right. And the people investors are awesome. They answer questions quickly, and just making sure it's investment properties. You can't use a 1031 for your primary residence. That'll get you in trouble with the IRS. So don't try to do that.
Well, great. Well, I threw the 1031 at you.
Yeah.
I just noticed on your website that you did that. So that's
Yeah.
great. And that's valuable information.
Yes.
Above and beyond what we were talking about with the enhanced
Yeah.
policies.
And that goes a little bit with the estate planning piece too, because 1031 is you don't get out of paying the taxes, you're deferring the taxes. So really you're kicking them down the road. So if you have kids who are going to be inheriting investment property from you, that's going to be something you need to consider in your estate planning, because they are going to take that property what we call a stepped up basis, but they might have a taxable event if they go to sell that property. So it's a good piece to have with your estate planning as well, considering all that stuff.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, as far as the estate portion of what you're talking about, that we could move that into talking about the enhanced policy, because
Yes.
one thing that was really neat about the enhanced policy. So I was just going to talk briefly about the enhanced policy for those that are watching that may not be familiar. There's two different policies that are available for the homeowner. One is what we call the standard policy. It's the policy that has been issued for, I don't know, going back before to 2013 or
Yes,
something like
yes.
that. And then after 2013, there was this new policy created called the enhanced policy. And what that policy does is it offers some protections that a standard policy wouldn't normally offer.
That's right.
There is a little bit of an additional premium for that policy. And I know part of the reason why I think a lot of people steered clear of that enhanced policy from 2013 to today is because of that additional cost. What most people don't realize is that cost is only about $50 for every $100,000.
That's right.
And the people are only paying that one time. It's a one-time cost. So for that extra 50 per 100,000, it covers quite a bit. And one of the things that I noticed about it was that there's some additional coverages there for heirs of property that
Yes.
wouldn't normally be in place with a standard policy. Is that correct?
The way that I understand it is that inherited property, the beneficiaries under a will would keep the same title insurance policy. It would still be valid for them, which is not the case with the standard policy. I kind of call them the standard and the enhanced, or the plus or the premium policy. But with that enhanced policy, if you inherit a property and your parents or your grandparents had a title insurance policy on it and it was the enhanced policy, you're not going to need to get new owner's insurance. It's still going to be in place for you. Same thing with beneficiaries under a trust, which I thought was really unique, because not only does it cover the beneficiary or the owners of the trust, the grantors, so to speak, but to be able to pass that on without any probate, as long as the trustee consults an attorney and makes sure everything gets done as far as that conveyance, to still have that title insurance place, there's value right there that the beneficiaries are getting something that they wouldn't have with the standard policy. That's exactly right.
That's great. And then the one thing I did know about this enhanced policy, one of the nuances is that it doesn't actually cover, like, if property is taken in the name of like an LLC or a business entity. Is that, I think that's maybe a difference too.
Yes, I was actually at an investors CLE a couple weeks back, and they touched on this, that the enhanced policy is not best for investment properties. It's going to be for natural persons or a legal agreement that acts as a natural person like a trust. So if you can still get that standard policy to cover a property that's in your LLC, but this enhanced policy is not going to be the best product if you're buying and holding investment properties, especially for residential rentals and things like that. The standard policy is going to be the best bet for you.
That makes sense. And one of the things that I think makes this particular new policy, we're calling it new, but
Yeah.
it's really started to become more embraced, is, whenever I'm dealing with agents, I'm always saying to them, guys, you always want to survey, no matter what. Just if you can survey it, survey it.
Yes.
But we understand the limitations around
Yes.
being able to get a survey, all the different reasons why a survey, you may not be able to get one prior to closing. And so what I say is this particular product may be good in instances where you can't get a survey for whatever reason, because there are some additional survey coverages that are included with the enhanced version that are a little bit above and beyond just a standard policy.
Yes, and I actually asked a question about this specifically at that investor CLE because I wanted to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Luckily, I was. With the standard policy that most people get now on your owner's policy, it covers, and the language is essentially any item that would have been found on a valid survey is going to be covered. What that means is you are protected if you have the survey done and there was a mistake made by your surveyor, right? So if you have a survey done and a mistake is made, that's not or I should say an encroachment is found, whether it's a fence or a carport or even part of the improved structure is over that boundary line or into an easement or a riparian buffer, something like that, that's not automatically covered by your title insurance. We get the surveys done so we can make the sellers fix those things before closing. You probably, agents that are watching this, probably have had to do an encroachment agreement at some point in time. It's an easy $100 to $150 fix to fix fences, minor encroachments for things like carports or anything like that. But we got to get those things fixed prior to closing. What the standard policy covers is basically if the surveyor made a mistake and there's an actual encroachment there that we didn't find on that survey, now title insurance is going to cover that mistake that should have been found. That's on the standard policy. My understanding is that with the enhanced policy, the idea is if a perfect survey would have found something and it wasn't found either because a survey wasn't done or just like before a survey was done incorrectly, that's going to be covered in the future by this enhanced policy. I think there's a deductible involved with certain aspects of that, but it's still going to be a lot cheaper than having to handle moving an entire fence yourself or God forbid, your shed with a concrete foundation is on your neighbor's property. Now we're talking about real expense. So
yeah, and I did read somewhere, if there's an improvement like a sun porch or something like that, and maybe not all the permits were pulled, which we know this kind of stuff happens. I know there's limitations, of course, like the insurer isn't going to cover $100,000 replacement of a porch or some crazy thing like that. But if the permit wasn't pulled and it's up to a certain amount, I think it's maybe $25,000 and there's a deductible. But if something like that comes up after closing, and that's the thing I try to say to agents, that title insurance historically has always been for anything that's happened in the past.
That's right.
And what's great about the enhanced policy is it does have like a couple little things that help if something comes up after closing, right?
Title insurance historically, that standard policy has looked out for essentially my mistakes, the attorney's mistakes, or the county record, the Register of Deeds misindexing, losing files, especially as we're going through this data migration in all of the North Carolina counties, something that should have been found but wasn't. That's what you were covered against. This enhanced policy, for like you said, if there's an addition, a sunroom or a garage or a man cave, and Johnny Builder with his shop class in high school builds this addition onto the property, doesn't pull any permits, it may or may not have been framed properly, wired properly electrically, if there's plumbing in there. If you don't find out about that, also get a home inspection.
Yes.
But if you didn't get the home inspection and you didn't find out about that until after closing, to a certain limit with a deductible, title insurance is going to help you do what it takes to get that brought to code.
To remedy it so that there's clear title, because it could cause a title claim if there is if it's unpermitted or something like that. It
Correct,
could be an issue moving forward.
An unpermitted addition is technically a zoning or a building code violation, and that means that there's potential fines, penalties, levies from a municipality, a county, a city that are out there and could be levied onto your property, which is a potential title issue. So it's really nice to have that extra peace of mind, I'd say.
And what we always we want to say, if you know if something in the seller says that there's an issue, you really don't want to ask for an enhanced policy in lieu of a survey or something like that. There's
That's
a reason why we ask for a survey. And I think you highlighted some of the things that are found with a survey, but maybe you could talk about easements and that sort of thing briefly, there's different things that you guys need to look for to make sure that the person that's buying the property knows exactly what they're buying.
Yes.
Because things can happen where, like if it's a utility easement, for instance, like what do you see sometimes with utility easements?
Well, I advise everybody to always get a survey every time you buy a piece of property. It's in my engagement letter. It spells out in bold letters, get a survey done. Here are the problems, potential problems if you don't. It's $800 to $850 now for most surveyors to do less than an acre. So that is a rather large expense for people who are already, paying for inspections, have money tied up in a due diligence deposit or earnest money deposit. So I understand when people are trying to cut costs. But some of the things we see, I just had a closing in Wilson County 2 weeks ago. We had a survey done. We had a setback encroachment. It was a 30-foot setback from the front boundary line. It was a house sitting in a cul-de-sac, and the front corner of the garage 4 or 5 feet into the setback.
Wow.
That's a zoning violation. That's a big problem. And Wilson County is really tough on that kind of stuff. They don't grant a lot of variances. They've been known to make people tear down their portions of their structure that are into the setback without granting that variance. To make matters worse, in the backyard, there was a sunroom that was built into a riparian buffer. So it was part of the Neuse River Basin.
Oh my.
Yep, and there was a little offshoot of a creek that needed to be left 30 feet wide for proper flow of any potential runoff from the Neuse River. So we had two major issues with that survey. And we were able to get the seller to fix those issues. Luckily, we didn't have to tear down any of the house. We were able to get some municipality leeway.
Negotiate a little
Yes,
bit on
exactly.
that.
But the seller had to hire an engineer, a civil engineer who went and found everything they needed to find to go make a case before the county planning board and get everything fixed prior to closing. If they didn't get that survey done, they were going to buy that property in the state that it was on the day of closing. And they were going to inherit those two problems. And there's no guarantee that it would have gone the same way for them trying to get that fixed, because they weren't going to find it until they go to sell that house, right?
Yeah.
And so their buyers were going to find that problem. So I tell everybody, get the survey done and let's get the sellers to fix the problems before closing. Even if you buy that enhanced policy and you have that coverage against those kinds of things, it's still going to be a headache for you when you're trying to sell that house. We're looking at delays in closings, right?
Yeah.
Time is of the essence. You don't want to be found in breach because you didn't know about an issue that you should have known about. Let's get the survey done. Let's get the sellers to fix things before we close, because closing's the only leverage you have, right? Once you close, that's your property.
That's it.
Yep.
Well, there was recently some news about a local businessman. I think he was a dentist that owned this beautiful home up here in North Raleigh. And I don't believe I talked about it on a podcast, but I use it to talk about title.
Yes.
So what we had, and I might be misstating the story, but it had something to do with the fact that there was a fraudulent deed that was recorded after this man had owned the home for a while, and he discovered that the fraudulent deed had been recorded. Talk to us a little bit about what that looks like from an attorney's perspective when all this happens. Like, say Mr. Dentist closed with you and he came back to you. What would you tell the dentist in this particular instance?
So we're seeing a rise in things like this. You get the emails from your former clients, and it's always the same question: can someone steal my deed? And that's not exactly right nomenclature, but you don't tell your client that. What I normally tell them, because they see the commercials also for title lock, right? If anybody who's watching the evening news, whichever side of the spectrum you're on, they're getting the title lock commercial, right? And so the title lock product, it doesn't keep people from forging a deed in your chain of title. All it does is catches them when they do it, so that they can help you get it fixed more quickly. In this particular instance, this guy was, as far as I know, he was living in this house, which is even more strange. We normally are seeing it with vacant land or rental properties that the owners aren't necessarily watching that piece of property, aren't keeping an eye on that piece of property, or don't have a day-to-day interaction with that piece of property. But in any case, in a perfect world, it would fall in the Register of Deed, right? The Register of Deeds saw that deed. And what happened in this particular case, and what happens in most cases, is the public record is a public record. Anybody with internet access or who can get down to the courthouse can pull a copy of any deed filed in that county. And they took that deed, and they were savvy enough to know how to make a new deed and put a proper legal description on it, and everything looked fine on it. And then they used Adobe Acrobat or whatever else, any of these PDF programs that are pretty cheap and easy to use, to put a fake notary stamp on it. And I hope it was a fake notary stamp and a fraudulent notary signature. If they were able to find a notary who helped in that, we're
That's a
talking
whole nother level.
now we're talking criminal, right?
Yes.
But let's hope, for the sake of argument, that they forged that notary signature as well as forged that buyer signature and put a fake notary stamp on it. The Registry of Deeds, in a perfect world, they'd be checking every notary stamp against the database. But we've got 100 counties in North Carolina, and the registers of deeds, or the notaries, I should say, are registered through the Register of Deeds. And so pragmatically, they're not going to check that database every time a deed comes in. They're just looking for proper execution, and then that deed gets put into the record. So once that deed gets put into the record, does that fraudster now own the property? No. They might have a claim to legal title on it, but they don't have any equity in that property, and they don't really have legal title. So once it was discovered, they had to backtrack. They had to find this fraudster. They had to get it fixed. A normal title insurance policy doesn't cover that. So all these costs of going to attorneys and everybody else to get this fixed was coming out of this guy's pocket. Registry of Deeds doesn't have any liability in it because they don't have a professional responsibility or any fiduciary duty to the public to make sure that deeds are legitimate.
And we rely on your legal opinion. You do the search, you're looking at everything, you're looking at for stuff like this.
Yes.
And so that's what I try to explain to people when they get really nervous about this stuff. I'm like, that's why we're in an attorney state.
Yes.
And we're very fortunate that we're in an attorney state.
And that's what I tell people is that, that's why it makes more difference on vacant land, right? Because typically vacant land are not carrying any mortgages, deeds of trust, liens, encumbrances. So you could theoretically forge a deed to get that property into your name, and then move it quickly again, sell it to somebody else. And if you've got, I don't want to use the word lazy, but if you've got an attorney who's not doing all of their due diligence in this title search, and they don't see that this deed in this chain looks kind of weird, and doesn't look into it a little bit further, that property could be gone.
Or just a really savvy fraudster that was able to put it in there in
That's
a way
true.
that so
That's right. It could slip past any attorney.
Yeah.
But you're not going to, I tell people all the time, they're not really going to be able to refinance this property or sell this property if it's your primary residence, particularly if you're carrying a mortgage or a deed of trust on it, because that's going to set off red lights for every attorney in this state. I would hope that this is my seller, and the seller in the previous chain had a mortgage that was never satisfied. I'm going back and I'm finding the attorney who filed or drafted this deed. If it wasn't an attorney, then I'm going back to the previous owner. I'm going to track them down however I can, or even go to that mortgage company and say, was this ever satisfied? Are these people still making payments on this? I'm going to get to the bottom of it. So it's a lot harder to steal title to a property if it's somebody's primary residence, if they're carrying a mortgage. But vacant land, houses that are paid off in full and people aren't, monitoring that kind of thing, it could happen. It could slip by anybody. And so it brings back that title lock. I don't know how much title lock costs, but it's a monthly charge, I know. Mm-hmm. Whereas the enhanced policy, that title security, so to speak, is built into it for that one-time premium. If someone tries to forge that deed, and if they're successful in forging a deed and inserting themselves into the chain of title, then you don't have to fix this yourself. You call Shannon at Key Title and say something. You call me, and then I call Shannon, and then we get it fixed for you.
Well, one of the things I heard, not to pick on this dentist, it was a horrible situation, but he was saying, I'm going to have to pay an attorney to try to get this all unwound. Mm-hmm. And if there had been an enhanced, now I don't know this particular instance, there could have been a lot more nuances. And I always say, I always say you always have to defer back to the attorney that handled settlement because they've got the entire file. They have the full picture. From a title perspective, we're only getting a portion of it. We may not know the whole thing. But, in this case, the dentist had to come out of pocket.
Yes.
And he might have saved some money had he had a policy like this, maybe. At least it's one more layer of something that might have helped him in that case.
Yeah, I'm not going to do the math because first thing I learned in law school is don't do math without a calculator. But if it cost him even $500 extra for the enhanced policy, that probably would have been cheaper than what he came out of pocket to use your words, to unwind everything that had been done. And that's just to fix the title. Now, if you want to pursue criminal charges against somebody, Now we're talking about
That's a whole
criminal
nother level.
attorneys and different. Yeah, it's more expense if you want to fully take it to justice. So that's true.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, these different areas of law that you've practiced. One of the things I did notice, and I'll finish with this, is that you did have a curative background.
Yes.
And one of the things I've been telling agents is you really want to try to find an attorney or a law firm that has that background right now, because what we're finding from the title side of things is we're finding things that require a lot of unwinding. All of a
Yes.
sudden
Yes.
it seems like the transactions are getting a little bit more challenging. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm really grateful that we have two attorneys on staff, because they
Yes.
can help work in tandem with you guys when
Yes.
you have something that comes up and you're looking at it from that background of what's going to happen later down the road for this person. You want to make sure that the mortgage company is protected. You want to make
Yes.
sure that the consumer is protected. So, I think having that curative background is super helpful, especially in times like what we're experiencing right now. Because
Yes.
there's a lot of fraud and a lot of different things, like the land scams and the different things like that.
Yeah, I cut my teeth in this industry. When I was teaching, one of my students' father was an attorney here in Raleigh, Matt Schweitzer. He has a partner at the time, Gene Davis. Y'all might know Matt and Gene. And they asked me if I wanted to come intern for them. And I said, sure, I'd love to, absolutely. At the time, I wasn't positive that I wanted to go into real estate law, but I said, I'll take this opportunity. And they would hand me boxes of files from Cumberland County.
Oh, say no more.
And out in the middle of like Rayford, and a lot of it was just curative.
And we have a lot of Rayford. We have a lot of referring partners in Rayford, so we love Rayford.
Yes,
Yes.
and these were the old meets and bounds
Yeah.
descriptions from the maple tree to the tire to the bluff,
Iron post to the
exactly,
quarter,
exactly,
old oak tree.
And so I cut my teeth on that stuff. So now I think of every title search that I do as if, what am I going to do to make sure that I don't have to go back and cure title on this later? My other mentor, Angie Morris, she said, do every single title search as if Lawyers Mutual is looking at you do that title search, right?
And Lawyers Mutual, here's your,
Yes.
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 In case you make any mistakes on that side.
Yes, exactly. It's because if I have to make a claim, Lawyers Mutual is going to want to see my file, right?
Yeah.
So I search everything back with that, thinking about those old bad meets and bounds descriptions and presenting a full picture of a title to somebody so that I don't have to cure. But if I ever, and I do come across them every once in a while, that something's got to get fixed.
You got to unwind something.
You got to unwind something. Having that background helps a lot.
It's so good. And it seems to be very, very needed at the moment, because
Yes.
like we're hearing so much about the fraud and the vacant land scam and all the different things. And it's when you have that background and you've seen what it can look like, that unmarketability of title because it wasn't handled correctly on the front end is huge. So,
And you want to know the number one thing that I see when people have title issues? And I'm not going to name names, obviously, but when someone goes to their attorney and says, do I really need to pay $250 for this title insurance policy? And the attorney says, no, not if you don't want to. And they say, okay, I'd rather not. So
like on a cash transaction
on
or
a
something.
cash
where they
transaction, and the attorney says, well, I looked at title and it's pretty clean. Not only does that make that attorney, I'm not going to say not look at that title as closely as they would, but I think there's a kind of a natural instinct of, well, I'm not going to have to issue a certifying opinion on this piece of property now. They're not getting title insurance, so maybe I'm not looking at it as closely. Maybe if I've got 155 hits on my outs, I'm not going to open all 155. I'm just going to look at the index. And that's when things get missed, and that's when things end up back to me when a real estate agent calls me and says, I'm over at this attorney's office and we're trying to close, and then they say this is wrong. Can you take a look at it? And I say, oh yeah, that was a mistake made 20 years ago, and it's been propagated in that chain of title ever since. And it normally goes back to a deed with no stamps on it, and a line item that says no title opinion given nor requested. So
that's why on the cash transactions, make sure you get title
get the
insurance.
title insurance. It's literally
the cheapest insurance you could get.
Literally
really, when you
before I
think about
walked
it.
in here,
Yeah.
I was on the phone with somebody on a cash transaction in Wilson. It's only about a $200,000 property. And they said, do I really need this title insurance? And I spent 15 minutes explaining to them. And before I hung up and saw Jamie in the parking lot, she said, all right, I'll get the title insurance. When I explain to people the relatively low cost for the protection in a grand scheme of, if there's a $30,000 equity line out there that never got canceled, never got paid off, this is really cheap protection. I've never had a single client say, no, I still don't want it. So Get the title insurance.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and what's good is having somebody with your experience, and then we've got the 2 attorneys on staff, and all of our underwriters average like 20 years of experience
Yeah.
too. They've seen it all. They're not going to put what we call general exceptions on things. They're going to tailor the policy to the property. They're
right.
going to work with your legal opinion, make sure that that is tailored specifically to the property. And we've got people with curative background too. So we've
Yes.
seen all kinds of crazy stuff, and we're trying to work on the front end. And this is the stuff a lot of people don't realize that happens behind the scenes and why it matters who you work with.
That's right.
So,
That's exactly right.
well, I really do appreciate your time,
I was happy to be
Caleb.
here.
I
This was
feel like
fun.
it was a great conversation.
Yeah, I feel like it
and
went super fast. I guess we were having
It
fun.
did. We did. So we're title nerds, apparently,
Yeah, that's
right?
true. That's true.
But that being said, thank you, Caleb. Don't forget to think about referring some business to Caleb Varnell.
Absolutely.
I'm Shannon Smith with Key Title. Again, thank you so much, and we hope you guys have much success. If you run into any fraud or any crazy thing that you need a question answered, reach out to us. We're here. I've got my info at keytitlellc.net. Shoot us an email. We can look at it or go to your go-to attorney, and hopefully that'll be Caleb. Thanks.
Absolutely right. Thank you.